The bourbon hit my jacket at exactly 8:47 p.m. I remember the time because I looked down at my watch the moment it happened, not out of anger, but out of habit. After 30 years structuring billion-dollar infrastructure deals, you learn to timestamp everything. The glass tilted slowly in his hand. Amber liquid spread across the front of my charcoal blazer, while 200 executives stood inside the ballroom of the Rowan Infrastructure Gala. A few people laughed, not everyone, but enough. The man holding the empty glass was Jace Rowan, 32 years old, vice president of operations, and the son of the company's founder. He glanced at my badge, then at my jacket, and jerked his chin toward the catering hallway. Washed up old lady, that way. The cameras were still rolling, 3 of them, mounted near the stage for the investor live stream scheduled later that night. I noticed the small red recording lights before I noticed the bourbon soaking through the fabric. Across the room, Grant Rowan, the CEO, stood beside a group of board members. His wife Diane was closer, maybe 10 feet away. She saw the whole thing. Our eyes met for half a second before she turned and walked toward another group of guests as if nothing had happened. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't wipe the jacket. I didn't say a word. I simply stood there and let the room see exactly what had happened. My name is Adriana Vale. I'm 48 years old, and I'm the managing partner of Vale Meridian Capital. At that moment, I was also the only person in that ballroom authorized to release $1.8 billion into Rowan Infrastructure's modernization project. And not a single dollar had been wired yet. Inside my briefcase, resting quietly in a side pocket, was a slim titanium authorization key, the encrypted device required to finalize the capital transfer. Most people in that room thought the deal had already been closed. They were wrong, because the final approval always comes last. And sometimes the most important data in a negotiation doesn't come from spreadsheets or forecasts. Sometimes it comes from watching how people behave when they believe the outcome is already guaranteed. Before we continue, a quick note. And as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. Because when the bourbon hit my jacket at 8:47 p.m., something else happened that no one in that ballroom noticed. They had just tested a covenant worth $1.8 billion. So the real question was this: what happens when the only person who can release the money decides the deal just failed the test? I left the gala without saying goodbye to anyone. No confrontation, no raised voice, just a quiet walk past the marble lobby and out into the cool night air while the music and laughter continued behind the glass doors. Most people assumed the evening had gone exactly as planned. That was the interesting part. After 30 years in infrastructure finance, I've learned that the most valuable information in any deal rarely comes from financial reports or investor presentations. It comes from behavior, patterns, the way people act when they believe the money is already theirs. I built my career structuring international infrastructure financing ports, transit systems, energy grids, projects large enough that mistakes didn't just cost companies money, they reshaped entire markets. Deals like that don't move on enthusiasm. They move on discipline, which is why capital authorization always happens last. My firm, Vale Meridian Capital, had spent 6 months structuring Rowan Infrastructure's modernization project, a 5-year development plan spanning 3 continents. Total capital commitment, $1.8 billion, deployed in stages tied to performance milestones. By the time the gala happened, every legal document had been drafted. The press team had already written the announcement. Industry media were preparing headlines about Rowan Infrastructure entering a new era of global expansion. To anyone reading those articles, the deal looked finished. But appearances are rarely accurate in finance, because not a single dollar had actually moved. The first funding tranche still required final authorization. Mine. Back in my hotel suite that night, I placed my briefcase on the desk and opened it. Inside the side pocket rested the titanium authorization key, the encrypted device required to release the capital transfer. Without it, the money simply stayed where it was. Then I opened the financing binder and flipped to a page I hadn't needed to think about in years. Section 12.8, the Governance Conduct Covenant. I added that clause after a project 12 years ago where a CEO humiliated one of his own managers in front of investors. I ignored the signal and closed the deal anyway. 11 months later, the company collapsed into a governance scandal that cost our partners hundreds of millions. I never made that mistake again, because leadership behavior isn't a side issue in infrastructure financing. It's a risk factor. Which raises an interesting question. If governance risk matters enough to appear inside a billion-dollar financing agreement, why would that agreement care about how executives behave at a party 6 months earlier? The Rowan infrastructure deal was still just a framework, a stack of draft agreements, financial projections, and legal revisions moving slowly between conference rooms in New York, London, and Singapore. That's where billion-dollar partnerships are actually built long before the press releases, the gala dinners, or the photographs of executives shaking hands. At that stage, my job wasn't to celebrate the deal. It was to protect the capital behind it. During the fourth round of contract revisions, I asked our legal team to add a clause most executives rarely pay attention to. Section 12.8, Governance Conduct Covenant. The language itself was simple. If leadership behavior during the negotiation or closing period created a reputational risk that could damage investor confidence, the capital partner retained the right to immediately suspend the funding commitment, not review it, not delay it, suspend it. Rowan Infrastructure's lawyers didn't like the clause at first. For 2 weeks, the document moved back and forth across legal teams while they tried to narrow the wording. The company's chief financial officer argued that behavior at social events shouldn't influence financing decisions. I explained that investors didn't separate the two. Eventually, but the CFO agreed to include the covenant exactly as written, mostly because the clause never mentioned me. Not once. It didn't say Adriana Vale. It didn't say Vale Meridian Capital. The clause referred only to capital partner authorization rights, a neutral legal structure that applied to whoever controlled the funding decision. That detail made the clause easy to overlook, but buried inside the language were two rules that mattered more than anyone realized. First, the covenant required no proof of intent. It didn't matter whether misconduct was accidental, deliberate, or misunderstood. The only standard was measurable impact on investor confidence. Second, the covenant applied during the entire negotiation and closing period, including the hours before the final funding authorization, which meant that documented evidence could activate it immediately. Evidence like legal testimony, written statements, or video recordings. Recordings like the 3 cameras still running inside the Rowan Infrastructure Gala Ballroom. So, what happens when a clause designed to measure leadership culture is tested the very morning a board expects to receive $1.8 billion? The boardroom looked exactly the way it always does when a company believes it's about to secure a historic deal. Clean glass walls, long walnut table, coffee already poured before anyone sat down. But there was one detail that mattered more than the furniture: the cameras. 3 of them mounted along the ceiling line, each marked by a small red indicator light. Rowan Infrastructure called it governance transparency, a live internal broadcast for senior managers and institutional observers who wanted to watch major board discussions in real time. 14 people sat around the table that morning: board directors, the company's legal counsel, the chief financial officer, and the man scheduled to become the next CEO once the capital partnership closed. I took a seat halfway down the table, close enough to watch everyone's reactions, but far enough from the head chair that I didn't appear to be directing the meeting. Grant Rowan stood at the front beside a projection screen. Founder, chairman, chief executive officer. A man who had built his company over nearly 3 decades and spoke with the comfortable confidence of someone used to controlling every room he entered. Today marks the beginning of a new phase for Rowan Infrastructure, he said as the first slide appeared behind him. A $1.8 billion capital partnership that will position this company for the next generation of global development. A few directors nodded. The CFO flipped open a binder. The presentation moved to the second slide. That was when I spoke. We should address last night. The room didn't explode. It simply tightened. Grant Rowan adjusted his cuff before answering. A social misunderstanding, he said calmly. Nothing more. A director across from me glanced toward the CFO. The CFO didn't look up. 2 seats down. The incoming CEO candidate shifted slightly in his chair. He had been at the gala. He had seen the bourbon hit my jacket. He had also said nothing. Grant continued speaking as if the subject had already been settled. We're here to finalize the capital authorization, he said. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I simply sat back and let the silence stay in the room. Because the interesting thing about boardrooms is that the most important conversations aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes they're the ones everyone tries not to have. especially when the cameras are recording every second. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when the CEO dismisses the one issue investors are actually watching? For a moment after Grant Rowan dismissed the incident, no one spoke. Then Curtis Hale, the lead independent director, leaned forward slightly and folded his hands on the table. He had spent 2 decades sitting on corporate boards, which meant he understood something many executives forget. Silence in a boardroom usually means someone is about to ask the question everyone else is avoiding. Before we move forward, Curtis said calmly, does last night's incident affect the funding structure in any way? Grant didn't hesitate. No, he replied. It has nothing to do with the transaction. Across the table, the CFO shifted uncomfortably. I waited a moment, then spoke. Why should investors trust the leadership culture after what we saw? The room tightened again. Grant turned toward me, irritation flashing briefly across his face before he smoothed it away. One unfortunate moment at a social event does not define this company, he said. Certainly not enough to jeopardize a $1.8 billion partnership. Curtis didn't argue. He simply opened the thick agreement binder sitting in front of him and began flipping through the pages. Paper rustled softly around the table as several directors did the same. When Curtis found the section he was looking for, he cleared his throat and read aloud. Section 12.8, Governance Conduct Covenant. If leadership behavior during the negotiation or closing period materially impacts investor confidence, the capital partner may suspend the funding commitment immediately. Grant gave a short, dismissive laugh. Boilerplate, he said. Every financing agreement contains language like that. The CFO finally spoke, his voice careful. That clause was specifically negotiated during the 4th revision, he said quietly. A few heads turned toward him. Grant waved a hand. It's still boilerplate. I reached into my briefcase, removed my phone, and placed it face up on the table. Not as a threat, as clarity. There's another detail, I said. Curtis looked up. The primary capital tranche requires final authorization from the managing partner of Vale Meridian Capital. I continued, which means the release of the first $1.8 billion requires a single signature. Grant frowned. Whose? I met his eyes. Mine. The recalculation moved around the table at different speeds. Curtis closed his binder slowly. The CFO stopped writing. Someone near the end of the table set down a coffee cup that suddenly felt heavier than it had a moment earlier, because the board had just realized something important. The capital partnership everyone believed was already secured couldn't move at all without the person sitting quietly halfway down the table. Which raises a dangerous question. What happens when the person holding the signature key decides the covenant has just been triggered? No one spoke for several seconds after I explained the authorization structure. Grant Rowan leaned back in his chair, the confidence in his posture returning just enough to suggest he believed the moment would pass. This isn't how negotiations work, he said. You don't threaten a capital partnership over optics. I didn't answer, and instead, I picked up my phone. On the second ring, my general counsel answered, Nadine. Her voice was steady, professional, already expecting something serious. Execute section 12.8. I said, no drama, no raised voice, just a clear instruction. Confirmed, she replied immediately. Initiating suspension notice. I ended the call and placed the phone back on the table. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the chief financial officer's phone vibrated against the polished wood. A short, sharp buzz. He glanced at the screen. His expression didn't collapse. Experienced executives rarely show emotion in front of a board, but something behind his eyes went very still. He slowly turned the phone face down. Grant noticed. What is it? He asked. The CFO hesitated, then answered quietly. Automated notice from Vale Meridian Capital. Another vibration echoed across the table. Then another. Directors began reaching for their phones as messages arrived from assistants, legal teams, and investor relations staff who were suddenly trying to understand why the company's largest financing partner had triggered a covenant clause during a live board meeting. Grant leaned forward. This is a negotiating tactic, he said firmly. Temporary pressure. Nothing more. No one responded. Because the notifications were spreading faster than anyone expected. Investor relations was already receiving inquiries. Institutional partners were asking whether the capital commitment had just been suspended. And somewhere inside the company's internal broadcast system, the cameras mounted along the ceiling continued recording every second of the conversation, which meant the people watching the live stream were seeing exactly what the board was seeing. $1 billion partnership freezing in real time. What most of them didn't know yet was that Nadine had already prepared the withdrawal notice hours earlier. The suspension was only the first step. Which raises a question most companies never have to answer. How quickly can a billion-dollar capital commitment disappear once investors lose confidence? The first sign that the situation had moved beyond the boardroom came from the screen behind Grant Rowan. The presentation slides disappeared. In their place, the company's market dashboard appeared automatically, something the AV team used during major financial announcements. Pre-market indicators had just opened. For a moment, no one said anything. Then the number changed. -6%. A quiet shift ran through the room. The chief financial officer checked his phone again. 2 new messages had appeared while the last one was still on the screen. Investor relations, treasury. Across the table, another director leaned toward the display. "Why is the market moving already?" he asked. The CFO answered without looking up. "Investors monitor covenant alerts," he said. If the suspension notice triggered external reporting systems, some funds would react immediately. The number on the screen moved again. -9%. Grant Rowan exhaled slowly through his nose. "This is exactly what I warned about," he said. "Overreaction." But the phones around the table kept vibrating. Institutional partners were pausing secondary commitments tied to the modernization plan. One of the directors read a message from a banking contact. They're requesting updated exposure models before noon. Another director looked toward legal counsel. "Credit agencies just flagged governance review?" Grant's voice hardened. Markets panic. That doesn't mean leadership collapses, but the conversation around the table had already changed direction. The independent director leaned toward the board counsel. "We need to discuss fiduciary exposure," he said quietly. Across the room, the incoming CEO candidate had gone completely silent. His appointment had been scheduled to follow the successful closing of the capital partnership. Without the funding, that transition suddenly looked far less certain. The market ticker shifted again, -12%. This time, no one pretended it was temporary, because something else was happening that Grant Rowan hadn't fully understood yet. The suspension of capital wasn't just a financing problem, it was a signal. And signals travel very quickly through financial markets, which leads to a difficult question for any board of directors. What happens when the company's biggest investor publicly loses confidence in its leadership? Curtis Hale waited until the market ticker behind Grant Rowan dropped another point before he spoke again. "Executive session," he said calmly. "Board members only." The words landed like a quiet alarm. Grant turned toward him immediately. "I'm the chair of this board," he said. "There's no reason to suspend the meeting." Curtis didn't raise his voice. "There is if fiduciary exposure is involved." Several directors exchanged quick glances. At the far end of the table, the company's governance council adjusted a stack of papers and spoke carefully. "If the board knowingly proceeds with a capital structure that has just triggered a covenant suspension," she said, "directors could be exposed to liability for failing to address governance risk." The room grew very still. Behind Grant, the market ticker shifted again, -13%. No one commented on it. They didn't need to. Grant leaned forward. "This is temporary market noise," he insisted. "We are not destabilizing leadership because of a misunderstanding at a social event." Across the table, the incoming CEO candidate sat motionless. He had spoken twice during the meeting, both times to ask procedural questions. He had not once addressed what happened the night before. Curtis turned toward the board counsel again. "Call the vote." Grant stared at him. "You're overreacting." Curtis didn't respond. Instead, he looked around the table. "Motion for governance review," he said. "Temporary removal of the chairman pending investigation." One director spoke first. Second. The vote moved quickly after that, not unanimous, but decisive. When the final count was recorded, the motion had passed. Grant Rowan remained seated for a moment, staring at the table as if trying to understand when the room had stopped belonging to him. The cameras mounted above the boardroom quietly captured the entire moment. The founder of Rowan Infrastructure, realizing that the company he had built over 28 years was now moving forward without his authority. He stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and walked out without another word. And behind him, the market ticker moved again. No one looked at it, because the board had already reached the same conclusion the market had. Which raises a question every corporate leader eventually faces. How does a chairman lose the company he built in less than 1 hour? The official withdrawal notice was issued less than an hour after the board meeting ended. Vale Meridian Capital confirmed the suspension of the $1.8 billion funding commitment. effective immediately under Section 12(8) of the financing agreement. By midday, the news had reached every institutional partner involved in the project. Within another hour, the remaining members of the investor consortium announced they were pausing their secondary commitments indefinitely. The modernization project Rowan Infrastructure had spent 6 months promoting suddenly had no capital behind it. Inside the company, the situation moved quickly into formal governance review. The board appointed an interim leadership committee. Grant Rowan's position as chairman remained suspended pending investigation. The incoming CEO transition, previously scheduled for the following quarter, was placed on hold until further notice. Meanwhile, the company's public relations team tried to contain the damage. They issued a statement describing the events as a misunderstanding at a private social event. But investors rarely rely on press statements when evaluating risk. They rely on signals. And the signals coming out of the boardroom that morning had been recorded by cameras, distributed across internal networks, and quietly discussed among institutional partners throughout the day. By late afternoon, my phone began ringing. One call from a pension fund manager, another from a sovereign investment advisor, two from infrastructure banks that had originally planned to co-finance later project stages. None of them asked why the covenant had been triggered. They already understood. What they wanted to know was whether our firm would consider structuring future deals without Rowan Infrastructure. Trust, once broken, rarely returns to its original shape. Later that evening, there was a knock on the conference room door where I had been taking calls. When I opened it, a young woman stood in the hallway. "Brooke Rowan," she said, "my uncle's niece." She looked barely 25. "I just wanted to say something before you leave," she continued. "What happened last night wasn't right." She paused, searching for the right words, "and not everyone in this family thought it was acceptable." I nodded. "Thank you," I said. "That matters more than you think." 3 weeks later, another message arrived, this one from Grant Rowan himself. He wanted to meet, privately, because when trust disappears in a capital partnership, companies eventually ask the same question. Is there any way to convince investors to come back 3 weeks later? Grant Rowan asked to meet. No cameras, no board members, no lawyers. Just a conference room in a quiet office building overlooking the river that ran through the financial district. He was already sitting when I arrived. Not at the head of the table. I noticed that immediately. For a man who had spent nearly 30 years running every room he entered, choosing a seat along the side told me he finally understood how much the structure had changed. "I appreciate you coming," he said. His voice sounded calmer than it had in the boardroom, though the confidence that once filled it had faded slightly. "I'll ask the direct question," he continued. "Is there any path for the capital to return?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't answer right. Outside the window, a cargo barge moved slowly along the river. Then I said the thing he needed to hear. This was never about the bourbon. He looked at me. The incident itself wasn't the problem. I continued. It was what happened after. The silence, yes. I leaned forward slightly. A leadership culture reveals itself in moments like that. Your son's behavior, your wife walking away, the boardroom language the next morning, the hesitation from the next CEO. Those weren't isolated events. They were data. Grant exhaled slowly. And the covenant, he asked? It exists to measure exactly that. I said, investors don't just fund projects. They fund the people responsible for them. The room went quiet. Finally, he nodded once. The way executives do when they reach the point where argument no longer changes the outcome. I built that company for 28 years, he said. I know, I replied, and it's still standing. I stood and gathered my briefcase, but markets price risk quickly, and once investors see a leadership pattern, they rarely pretend they didn't. He didn't try to stop me when I walked to the door later that afternoon. I wrote a short internal memo for our firm's records. Another example of pattern recognition. Another reminder that capital doesn't move on promises. It moves on trust. And trust has a very precise price, which leaves one final question. In any boardroom, who really holds the power, the person with the title or the person holding the capital? Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with your perspective. We read everyone.